Female genital system. Female genital system or female reproductive system consists of primary sex organs, the two ovaries, the female excretory passages, which are the two fallopian tubes, one uterus and a vagina, then external genitalia and the mammary glands. The external genitalia includes clitoris, labia minora, labia majora, and the glands of parthenons. Ovaries are paired almond-shaped bodies located retroperitoneally on each side of the uterus, suspended from the broad ligament by the mesovarium. They are compound glands having both exocrine function, which is production of ova, and endocrine function, that is secretion of female sex hormones. At birth, the human ovary contains from about 300,000 to 400,000 ova, embedded in the cortical stroma. During the menstrual cycle, several follicles grow, but only one attains full maturity, and the rest degenerate. Adult ovary consists of cortex and medulla. The cortex is covered by the germinal epithelium, which is at first simple squamous, then becomes cuboidal. At menopause, the human ovary is shrunk and fibrous, has no follicles, and contains many corpora albicans. Structure. Adult ovary consists of cortex formed of stroma and parenchyma, and medulla formed of vascular stroma consisting of loose connective tissue rich in blood vessels and interstitial stroma cells. Stroma of the cortex is formed of tunica albuginea, which is a dense, less cellular connective tissue forming the capsule covered by the germinal epithelium. Stroma cells similar to fibrocytes, and reticular stroma formed of reticular cells and fibers. Parenchyma of the cortex is formed of follicles in different stages of maturation, different types of corpora, and interstitial cells not seen in human ovary, which may secrete female hormones in some animals. Adult ovary consists of cortex and medulla. Cortex is formed of stroma and parenchyma. Stroma of the ovary consists of tunica albuginea forming the capsule covered by the germinal epithelium. Stromal cells similar to fibrocytes, reticular stroma formed of reticular cells and fibers. Parenchyma is formed of follicles, different types of corpora, and interstitial cells, ISC. Medulla is formed of vascular stroma containing blood vessels. Division between cortex and medulla is indistinct. Ovarian follicles are located in the cortex and consist of immature ova surrounded by one or more layers of follicular cells. Primordial follicles are composed of a primary oocyte arrested in the first meiotic division, surrounded by a single layer of squamous follicular cells, granulosa cells, with a very thin zona pellucida, not well apparent. They are found in the peripheral cortex, beneath the tunica albuginea, especially in young females before puberty. Primary follicles. At puberty, follicle-stimulating hormone of the pituitary stimulates the development of small number of primordial follicles. There is enlargement of the oocyte and increase in organelles and accumulation of lipid droplets, lipochrome pigments, and yolk granules. Zona pellucida becomes prominent, surrounded by cuboidal or columnar cells, and this follicle is called unilamellar primary follicle. Continuous follicle-stimulating hormone secretion induces the granulosa cells to divide and form a number of layers, multi-layers, around the follicles. This is called multilaminar primary follicle. The stroma around the growing follicle forms a capsule, theca folliculi, which differentiates into two layers, an inner secretory theca interna and outer fibrous layer theca externa. Blood vessels penetrate the theca externa to supply the theca interna. Secondary follicles are composed of a primary oocyte surrounded by several layers of polyhedral cells, which start to secrete fluid, liquor folliculi, which accumulates between the cells, forming a wide cavity, follicular antrum, pushing the ovum to one side. Mature Greffian follicle. It is a large macroscopic structure, about 1 centimeter in diameter, occupying the whole thickness of the ovarian cortex and bulges from the surface. Mature Greffian follicle is rounded, thin-walled vesicle with a wide follicular cavity containing fluid, liquor folliculi. Mature Greffian follicle contains the ovum, secondary oocyte, which is large, rounded, with an eccentric nucleus present at one side of the Greffian follicle, covered by the zona pellucida, and surrounded by columnar granulosa cells called the corona radiata, which is tightly adherent to the ovum. Follicular cells that line the follicular cavity form a sort of stratified epithelium called the zona granulosa. The ovum is connected to the wall of the follicle by a mass of cells called the discus proligerus or camelus oophorus. Mature Greffian follicle is surrounded by a capsule formed of stroma cells, theca folliculi, consisting of outer dense theca externa and inner loose vascular and secretory theca interna. Other structures present in the cortex of adult ovary are degenerative follicles and corpora. Degenerative follicles or atretic follicles or corpus atreticum result from degenerative changes occurring in most follicles, in both ovum and follicular cells, from birth till few years after menopause. In growing follicles, degenerative changes occur in ovum, stratum granulosum, and lastly the theca interna, with the formation of a thick glassy membrane from the basal lamina between granulosa cells and the theca interna, forming atretic follicles or corpus atreticum. Corpus luteum, on the other hand, results from ovulation of the mature Greffian follicle and loss of intrafollicular fluid. The zona granulosa becomes folded, forming a small yellow body, corpus luteum, the central cavity of which contains remains of liquor folliculi and sometimes RBCs. In certain animals is called corpus hemorrhagical. If no fertilization occurs, corpus luteum degenerates to corpus albicans or fibrous bodies. Thus, we have two different types of degenerative corpora. Corpus atreticum resulting from degenerated follicles and corpus albicans resulting from degenerated corpus luteum. Mature Graafian follicle and its fate. Mature Graafian follicle is a large macroscopic structure about 1 centimeter in diameter, occupying the whole thickness of the ovarian cortex and bulges from the surface. Mature Graafian follicle is a rounded, thin-walled vesicle with a wide follicular cavity containing fluid, liquor folliculi. It contains the ovum, secondary oocyte, which is large, rounded, with an eccentric nucleus present at one side of the Graafian follicle, covered by the zona pellucida, and surrounded by columnar granulosa cells called the corona radiata, which is tightly adherent to the ovum. The follicular cells that line the follicular cavity form a sort of stratified epithelium called zona granulosa. The ovum is connected to the wall of the follicle by a mass of cells called the discus proligerus or camelus oophorus. Mature Graafian follicle is surrounded by a capsule of stroma cells, theca folliculi, formed of outer dense theca externa and inner loose vascular and secretory theca interna. Blood vessels from the theca externa penetrate to supply the theca interna. Fate of mature Graafian follicle. Formation of atretic follicles. Degenerative changes occur in most follicles in both ovum and follicular cells, stratum granulosum, and lastly the theca interna, with the formation of corpus atreticum or atretic follicles. Ovulation and formation of corpus luteum. Ovulation means rupture of mature follicle and liberation of the ovum, secondary oocyte, and corona radiata. It occurs at the mid-menstrual period under the effect of luteinizing hormone of the anterior pituitary, leading to increased secretion of liquor folliculi, causing expansion of the follicle and rupture, with subsequent formation of corpus luteum. Corpus luteum formation. Following ovulation and loss of the intrafollicular fluid, the zona granulosa enlarges and becomes folded and full of yellow lipochrome pigment to form the granulosa lutein cells, which are large, pale cells secreting progesterone. The cells of the theca interna undergo similar changes to become the theca lutein cells, but they are small and dark, secreting estrogen. The central cavity contains remains of liquor folliculi and sometimes RBCs. If no fertilization occurs, corpus luteum degenerates to corpus albicans or fibrous bodies. Fate, function, and types of corpus luteum and other corpora. Corpus luteum. Following ovulation and loss of the intrafollicular fluid, the zona granulosa becomes folded. The central cavity contains remains of liquid folliculi, which may contain RBCs. This is called corpus hemorrhagicum in animals.
corpus luteum of menstruation. If no fertilization occurs after 10 days, it stops functioning, undergoes involution, and is converted to corpus albicans. Corpus albicans. This is a degenerated corpus luteum. Corpus atreticum. This is a degenerated follicle.
Oogenesis or ovogenesis is the process of formation of mature ovum. It is similar to spermatogenesis in male. It consists of the following phases: proliferation, oogonia, divide by mitosis to give daughter oogonia, having diploid number of chromosomes. This occurs in primary follicles. Growth. Daughter oogonia grow to primary oocytes, still having diploid number of chromosomes in growing follicles, and remain in arrested prophase stage of first meiotic division in childhood till puberty. Maturation. Primary oocyte divides by meiosis at puberty, just before ovulation, to give secondary oocyte and the first volar body, the first meiotic division, resulting in haploid number of D chromosomes, but still diploid amount of DNA. This occurs in mature Graafian follicle. The secondary oocyte divides by second meiotic division to give mature ovum and a second volar body. This occurs after ovulation in the fallopian tube.
Ovarian cycle. The ovaries undergo a continuous sequence of changes at puberty, regulated by gonadotrophic hormones of the anterior pituitary. Follicular phase. From V1 to day 14, it is correlated with the growth and maturation of follicles. Follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates the granulosa cells to produce estrogen. Together with follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone induces ovulation. Ovulation occurs at the mid-menstrual period, day 14, as a result of rise of estrogen, which inhibits the release of follicle-stimulating hormone and stimulates the release of luteinizing hormone by the pituitary, that causes completion of the first meiotic division and ovulation, formation of a corpus luteum, which secretes estrogen and progesterone. Luteal phase, in which the increasing level of progesterone inhibits the release of luteinizing hormone from the pituitary. Feedback mechanism, thus causing degeneration of the corpus luteum unless fertilization occurs. Finally, the estrogen levels diminish, so the secretion of follicle-stimulating hormone from the pituitary is no longer inhibited, and a new cycle of follicle formation is initiated. Notice, contraceptive pills contain synthetic analogues of progesterone and estrogen, thus inhibiting the follicular formation.